Welcome to week 7, the final week of seed school. This week, for the final week, it is all about brassicas. There is such a wonderful array of brassicas, and we're going to try to get through as much as possible. But if we do skip over a particular brassica that you're interested in growing, please feel free to ask about it at the end of the session. And here we go. Great. There are many in the brassica family, as we can see. There's Brassicaceae, which are the mustards, but not the only mustards. This is generally what's called the Indian mustards, though there are also Asian mustards that are part of this group as well. Brassica napus, primarily the rutabaga, some turnips, some rutabagas, turnips that are botanically rutabagas, like the Macamber turnip, the gill feather turnip, East Ham, Cape Cod turnip, not true turnips, and Siberian and Russian kale, most famously. And then the Brassica oleracea are the cole crops. That is a big group, and it's just amazing to take a moment and reflect on the fact that from one wild plant, not one single wild plant, but one species of wild plant, wild colewort, came all these different iterations: Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kohlrabi, broccoli. You see the whole list there. All careful human selection over years and years and years from the same wild plant to produce all these different parts. Some for flower buds, some for roots, some for greens, and so forth. Just really extraordinary to think of. Brassica rapa is also another group that has more of the Asian mustards like Mizuna and Tatsoi and Bok Choy. Also true turnip and salad turnip like Hakurai or Tokyo Market turnip. The radishes, Raphanus sativa, which we'll cover just a little bit. And then also lumped into the brassica family is arugula, Erica sativa, which we're not going to spend much time on today. Basically going to treat it interchangeable with the other annuals on this list. Just important to note here that wild arugula, as it's sometimes marketed, or sylvetta, is a different genus and species. So if you are growing arugula and sylvetta, or arugula and wild arugula, they are two different species and will not cross with one another. So just a quick refresher here on vernalization and storage of biennials. I know we've talked about this a few times, but worth mentioning yet again. So you see in the pictures here, the top is us preparing our roots for their winter slumber, and then in the spring planting them back out. Haven't really shown many pictures of this to date. So this is a good illustration of the sort of before and after once they enter storage. So in the fall time, ideally after a first frost, because all the brassicas have some degree of cold hardiness. You want to dig up either the roots if they're turnips or rutabagas, the stems if they're things like collards or kale and so forth, or bulbs if it's kohlrabi, and put them in storage by peeling everything back except the crown. You can see that top picture. Those are Macamber turnips, botanically Brassica napus or napus. And we've peeled off all the greens except for that little tip on the very top. That's where the magic energy of flower conversion will emerge, along with some side shoots as well. And so we store those in slightly moistened conditions. We, again, like to use wood shavings or sometimes sand. The sand is a lot heavier to deal with, so depending on your storage conditions, that's a consideration. But the idea is to keep the roots moistened and keep them from desiccating, but not be storing them only in garden soil, because there's the temptation there to be extracting nutrients and continue growing at a more rapid pace. Our general vernalization that works for pretty much everything, 10 to 12 weeks at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, that says anything below freezing, but it should say anything above freezing is okay for those. Many brassicas can tolerate a certain degree of freezing, but having them freeze in storage is problematic. So you want to keep them from freezing generally. So the mustards here, Brassicaceae, these are a true annual, as many of you who have grown mustard greens in the spring can attest to. Many mustard greens are also quite cold hardy. So this is another example, like we've mentioned before, I believe with spinach and maybe some others, of an annual that can also be treated as a biennial. So just anecdotally speaking, we treat mustard greens like they are a biennial because it's easier for us to do selection in the fall when they're big and verdant and beautiful, before racing the clock as they heat up and start to flower and set seed as they start to bolt. So we'll look at them in the fall, and then we'll dig up the plants themselves and store them just like you saw those turnips in the previous slide. Um, if you're already confident that you don't need to do a whole lot of selection, or you can look at things in the spring with a nice long window and basically cull out the things that you don't want, there's no reason to not grow them in the spring. It saves you having to store them for an entire season. But that's just another technique that's available to you if you choose to save seed from these. The seed type, as with all brassicas, it's a dry dehiscent seed. Dehiscent meaning when the seed pods are fully dry and mature, they shatter open. So this will come into play as we're talking about harvesting and processing later. The flower type for Brassicaceae is a perfect flower. Excuse me. Sometimes they tend towards self-pollinating, but generally speaking, with all brassicas, we treat them as though they were exclusively insect pollinated, because the degree of self-pollination with those that are self-compatible is not enough to have a significant impact unless you had one last mustard plant in the world and this was all or none, you could give it a shot. So that's why it's in parentheses there. Though the structure is perfect, meaning it has all the requisite parts to produce seed, generally we treat these as outcrossers because they would like a really wide population to be able to stay vigorous over time. Growing distance, as with other outcrossers that are insect pollinated, you see 800 feet to half a mile. At least 5 for viable seed. Certain species of mustard that may be cross-compatible, you could get away with 1 or 2. This would be like an emergency situation, or you had the last mustard plant or mustard seed on earth of this particular variety that you were trying. But generally, you want to have a big population for long-term genetic maintenance. So 100, 120 are more ideal. And again, like we talked about, there are techniques. If you have a smaller garden, you can save 30 or 40 for a while and introduce either older seed that has a wider breadth of genetics, or bring in new genetics periodically just to refresh them. So we're going to save the storage, the harvesting and processing and storage till the end, because they're basically interchangeable with brassicas, and just go through the different species one by one here so you get an overview of all the different species and their particular habits. So Brassica napus has some members of its species that are annuals, but the ones that we've talked about, the rutabagas, the turnips by any other name, and the Russian Siberian kale, these are all biennials. So generally, we treat Brassica napus as though they were all biennials. They tend to be more cold tolerant and frost hardy than other brassicas as well. So that's another added bonus if you're trying to overwinter things outdoors. Again, dry dehiscent seed. Brassica napus usually has more of a tendency towards self-fertile flowers. So if you had one rutabaga, it's more likely than with other species that you could produce viable seed, but this would be an emergency scenario. Insect pollination, again, as with all the other brassicas. So we have the same isolation distance as we saw with Brassicaceae. Here's a beautiful picture of some of the Macamber turnips in flower, tall and proud, staked using the Florida weave that we've mentioned before. Population size, you see here, it says 1 to 5 for viable seed. That's the one scenario where there is more of a tendency towards self-fertility in Brassica napus, but ideally, if you didn't know, you'd want to use at least 5 if it were an emergency scenario and you had enough at your disposal in this emergency scenario. 120 plus for genetic maintenance. If it's a really, if there's a wider berth of genetic diversity in these, you really ideally would want to be upwards of 200 plants to capture all of that requisite diversity to carry on long term. But just for a year or 2 or 3, or with the technique of introducing other types of seed in subsequent years, you can get away with less. Here's the cold crops, Brassica oleracea. These can be annual or biennial, depending on what you're growing. So important to get a sense of that ahead of time. The oleracea are, in almost every case, self-incompatible. So these ones, it's especially important to have a larger population size. Less plants will have a harder time of producing quality viable seed. Same isolation distance here, and at least 5 for viable seeds, since they do not possess self-fertility. This is a picture. We have a lot of great brassica pictures, so this is a bit of a show and tell with our visual slides here, but this is a beautiful purple stem collared green that we've been working with. Brassica rapa is true turnip, and then some of the other mustard greens and Asian greens that we discussed earlier. These can be annuals or biennials. In most cases, you can treat them as a biennial, as we mentioned before, but some of them, especially the Asian greens like Mizuna and bok choy and tatsoi, have no problem. They are definitive annuals and have no problem bolting, as many of you who have grown them in the spring can attest to. So if you, again, don't have the storage capacity, you're not really interested in that technique, this species, for those that are annual, a really nice opportunity to grow in the spring, harvest the seed midsummer, and be done in a couple of months. These are also self-incompatible. So as we'll see here, we want at least 5 for any type of viable seed, but upwards of 120 to 200 for the long-term genetic maintenance. Radishes, even though they're in the Brassica family, you can see they're a different genus and species. They are either annual or biennial. Generally speaking, the salad radishes, like a plum purple radish or French breakfast, those are annuals. And the storage radishes, the winter radishes like black Spanish radish or watermelon radish, those are biennials. So the latter definitely need the period of vernalization, which is consistent with how we would grow them. You don't want to grow a watermelon radish in the spring because you will not be very pleased with the result. So if you're growing them in fall as a storage crop, and they're listed as a winter radish, then you can be confident they're a biennial and require vernalization. Other radishes you could grow in the spring, as many of you have probably experienced who have grown radishes. Salad radishes, they have no problem bolting when it gets nice and hot. So another quicker, easier project if time and space are not on your side for biennials. The flower type, again, perfect. This one is also self-incompatible, so very important to have at least a few, ideally more than that. And both annual and biennial radishes, same genus and species, are cross-compatible with wild radish. So that's something to consider if you have meadows or roadsides nearby where you can identify wild radish populations, or you've grown tillage radish or something like that in a cover crop rotation and it's naturalized. You really want to pay attention to that because you will have very undesirable roots, and it will be very discouraging for you. So harvesting brassicas, like we said, the pods are dehiscent, which means when they are fully mature and dry, they want to shatter open at the touch. The lowest pods are the first mature, and they are usually the best seed. So they will shatter first in most cases, which means you have a couple different options. If you are fortunate enough to go through an entire season where they're fully dry, they're standing tan and brown in the field, the wind hasn't blown them open at this point, then you're going to have the most bang for your buck in terms of seed quantity. But you can also, as we've said before, kind of lean into the 2/3 rule. If you see them starting to dry down, the tips look like they're still a little bit green, but there's looking like there are tan brownish pods towards the bottom, you can split the difference if it's a larger population and harvest the entire stalks at that point. Either way, whether you have seed that's dehiscing immediately or not, you can cut those stalks and just right onto a tarp nearby. So what we do is we spread out a tarp adjacent to where our population is, and we cut and drop them right on. So if there's viable seed, it's falling right onto the tarp right away, and then that makes it easier for processing later. There are times where you have to harvest early. If you grow brassicas in place enough, the birds will start to become your friends, whether you want them to or not. And finches and other birds are specialists when it comes to eating brassicas, and they prefer that over a lot of other things. So at times, you have to resort to extraordinary measures. This here you can see, if you look closely, we have harvested turnips, Macamber turnips, so Brassica napus, and hung them upside down in a barn. The stalks are entirely green. The leaves are starting to yellow and fall off. We are going to have to, in this case, winnow out quite a bit of seed because a lot of seed that dries will not be fully mature when it dries, but we'll have enough mature seed here. What we're looking for is basically those long, slender brassica pods when they swell to the point that they look almost like a pea pod or something mature. You can see the bumps along those brassica pods. That's when there's a good chance that if you're pulling up the entire plant, or at least cutting the stalk right at the base, there's still energy enough in that plant to send towards the seed pods and get some of that seed to mature and keep them out of the mouths of birds. Other ways of dealing with that are, of course, bird exclusion netting. But keep in mind that a lot of species of Brassica can get upwards of 6 feet high, which means you have to have some pretty high hoops in order to adequately cover that when it's netting time. We have had some luck with wrapping things around them last minute if it's a smaller population so that the birds are discouraged from eating them. But if you're doing that, you have to have consideration of what you're wrapping and how you're trapping moisture in or excessively heating up the seeds themselves and losing viability that way. So this is sort of like an emergency scenario, but I have heard other seed growers say that many birds, finches especially, have rerouted their entire migratory patterns to pass over the farm once they know that there's good seed there to eat. So it's something to consider if you're growing brassicas, is keep an eye on them. If you see birds starting to visit them, then you want to have a game plan as soon as possible, because a flock of birds can descend on those and in a couple of days eat up most, if not all, of your seed. So for processing, again, this is all interchangeable. Once you've taken your stalks and put them onto a tarp, you can fold that tarp over. That's basically just protecting the brassica seeds themselves from getting stuck in your boots or your shoes, and also giving a little extra padding there so that you're not crushing seed. Though with brassica seeds, they're so small that this is not nearly as much of a concern as some other things that we've talked about tarping. And then you can either whack that with a stick and take the tarp back off and fluff the stalks around a little bit, have a look, make sure that all the pods are open. If not, just sort of rearrange them, keep whacking them again. Over time, you will have gotten them all out. Or you can just have a dance party right on top of that brassica pile and twist and shout. And that's a very easy way and a very fun and exciting way if you're many, or if you're not many and you're only one and you want to dance with yourself. There's no reason not to do that as well. After you've done that, you'll have basically the open dehisced pods and maybe some chaff as well, and you'll have the seeds. And so you can take this tarp and from either end, just start kind of, after you've removed these stalks, these very long stems, just start shaking that whole pile to the middle of the tarp. And one thing that I love about brassicas is that because the seeds are so small and the pods are significantly longer and generally don't tend to break up in the way that other chaff might, you can just gently sort of skim off the top as much of the pod material as you can, and you'll find this beautiful, viable seed right underneath that. And that's going to take a lot of the work out later when it comes to winnowing and cleaning that seed. If you do happen to have a lot of chaff, especially like finer debris, one thing that I didn't mention before, if you are pulling entire plants, as has been a consideration before, you may also be pulling up debris with them. You're pulling up soil or very small rocks or things like that. So especially in that case, it's important to give a good screening, because those small particles in a lot of cases can be the same weight as the seed itself and harder to clean out. So cleaner the better there. But if necessary, screens, sorting screens that we've talked about before, or even sometimes a colander, just to get some of the chaff out. And then if there's a very gentle breeze, even if there's not, and it feels pretty still, dropping from bin to bin, standing on a small ladder, that's air winnowing there. And a lot of the really light stuff just kind of blows off in the wind and your seed falls into the bottom bin. And then you just sort of repeat over and over again. Or using a fan, like a box fan, on a very low setting, far away enough that it's not blowing your seed away and out of your bin with the chaff that it's taking out. These are both options there. And it's always important to leave a tarp underneath as you're doing this, just in case there's a mistake, so that that teeny tiny brassica seed has not just sown itself on your lawn or in the soil adjacent to it. Brassicas tend to dry down very well because of their small size, but it's still important to give them a little test before you put them in. So fingernail test in there, and if the seed crushes or splits without squishing, then generally speaking, you are in good shape to put that in storage. I just mentioned the humidity strip here because, as Hannah brought to our attention earlier, this is a great way, if you do put the seed away, to put a simple monitor with this humidity strip inside and make sure that there's not excessive humidity in there, because there's nothing worse than opening that jar or that vessel in a couple months and smelling mold and having no viable seed in there. So Brassicas are one of the most wonderful and rewarding seeds to grow for a number of reasons. They're incredible pollinators, as pretty much all seed crops are when they're in flower, but they're also rewarding in terms of their yield. So if any of you are interested in growing on contract or having enough seed for a decade plus, 1 year of growing brassicas will give you a copious amount of seed. They are one of the most generous with their seed counts. So it's an excellent reason to grow them for that reason alone. It's not something that requires growing year after year after year to keep up with the amount of seed that you might need, especially on the garden scale. And brassica seed, generally speaking, tends to keep longer than many other types of seed. So I hope that you'll explore them and enjoy them and fall in love with them the way that we have. Be well. May your farms and gardens be abundant and give you hope and joy and inspire you to continue this work. It's essential and we can't do it without you. So thank you all so much for being a part of it and look forward to hearing about how the year goes for you.